The next kind of conjunction we're going to talk about is a subordinating conjunction. And unlike coordinating conjunctions, which can do many things, join two words, join two phrases, or join two independent clauses, subordinating conjunctions can only do one thing. We use them to write what's called complex sentences. And so let's start with just an example of what are some subordinating conjunctions. You'll see a list on the screen in front of you. Subordinating conjunctions are words that create a condition, meaning when they appear at the beginning of a sentence, they create a situation where the sentence is not a complete thought. For example, although I went to class, or after I picked up my brother from school, or since I graduated, these are what are called dependent clauses. They include a subject and a verb, but they don't include a complete thought. And the reason they don't include a complete thought is because these subordinating conjunctions appear at the beginning of them. So what a complex sentence is we have a simple sentence, right, that's made up of a subject and a verb, which we've talked about in the previous video. And we know that a simple sentence is also known as an independent clause. So we have our subject, we have our verb, and we have a complete thought. We also learned that a compound sentence is made up of two or more independent clauses. Or we can also say two or more simple sentences, and those can be joined in the middle by either a coordinating conjunction, one of your fanboys words, a semicolon, and a conjunctive adverb and a comma, right, one of our fancy conjunctions, or simply just a semicolon, which we didn't touch on. The other kind of sentence is what's called a complex sentence. And a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause and what's called a dependent clause. And these two clauses are joined by what's called a subordinating conjunction. Now that's a lot to think about, so let's get into some examples and see if we can clarify what's meant by all that. All right, so most importantly, a dependent clause is not a complete sentence. What it does is it begins with a subordinating conjunction. So for instance, after we finished our exam, and if you want to create narrative tension. Well, after we finished our exam does include a subject, we, and does include a verb, finished, but it's not a complete thought. And the reason why is because we haven't answered this condition. Well, what happens after we finish the exam? Or in our second example, if you want to create narrative tension, we have you, which is a subject, want, which is our verb, and then we have our whole predicate. You want to create narrative tension, but because the sentence begins with the word if, that's our subordinating conjunction, it makes it not a complete thought. And so therefore, these are both examples of what we call dependent clauses. We can revise those dependent clauses and attach an independent clause to them, thus creating what's called a complex sentence. If you want to create narrative tension in your writing, comma, you must create well-developed characters. So this first part of the sentence is what's called our dependent clause, and the second part of the sentence is what's called our independent clause. Think about independent clause, independent woman, right? The sentence can stand on its own. It's strong. It doesn't need anybody. So you must create well-developed characters. That's really just a simple sentence, but we can tack it on or combine it with a dependent clause so long as there is a subordinating conjunction. We can also flip it around. The subordinating conjunction can come either in the beginning of the sentence or it can come in the middle of the sentence. So you must create well-developed characters if you want to create narrative tension in your writing. If is still our subordinating conjunction, regardless of whether it appears in the beginning or the middle. And if you want to create narrative tension in your writing is still our dependent clause, whether it appears in the first half of the complex sentence or the second half. Let's take a look at a few more examples. After we finished our exam, the professor collected the tests. The professor collected the test is a complete sentence. It's an independent clause. However, after we finished our exam is a dependent clause. We know that because it begins with a subordinating conjunction. So we can write it that way, as in blue, or we can flip it, as in the green example. The professor collected the tests after we finished our exam. After is still your subordinating conjunction, and after we finished our exam is still your dependent clause. Unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly, we will continue to suffer. We will continue to suffer is a simple sentence or an independent clause. unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly is what's called a dependent clause. Again, we know that because unless here is our subordinating conjunction. And in the second example, we can flip it around. We will continue to suffer unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly. Again, in this case, unless is your subordinating conjunction, and unless we stand up to those who treat us unfairly is your dependent clause. Now, I want to just pause here and point out that when the dependent clause comes first, meaning when the sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, you have to put a comma in between the dependent clause and the independent clause. However, when the subordinating conjunction and the dependent clause comes second, no comma is needed, as in the green example, right? So let's go back and just take another look here. After we finished the exam, comma, but then the professor collected the tests after we finished our exam. So no comma is needed in the second example. However, a comma is needed in the first example. So just to recap, dependent clause comes first, comma, dependent clause comes second, no comma. All right, another example here. As we continue to use fossil fuels, the environment will be negatively affected. As long as is our subordinating conjunction, that creates your dependent clause. So we have our subordinating conjunction. We have we, which is our subject. Continue to use, which is our verb phrase. Continue to use fossil fuels is your predicate. So this is your dependent clause. And then you have your independent clause in the second half. Notice the comma here. However, when we flip it, the environment will be negatively affected as long as we continue to use fossil fuels. No comma is needed in the second example because the dependent clause comes second. Okay, remember, dependent clause is always the part of the sentence that has the subordinating conjunction attached to it. And you just kind of have to memorize what those subordinating conjunctions are. You can find them in your Hawkes Learning textbook. They are also can be found in Blackboard. Okay, so that wraps it up for complex sentences and subordinating conjunctions. The last video we'll talk about correlative conjunctions, so stay tuned for the last one.